Have you ever found yourself sort of grappling with those big questions like who really owns this land? Or maybe what responsibility do I actually have to future generations when I use resources today?
Yeah, those questions, they aren't just, abstract ideas for boardrooms or parliaments.
Not at all. They touch pretty much every part of our lives, right?
Yeah.
From climate change discussions and wealth distribution debates, right down to how we manage shared spaces in our neighborhoods.
Absolutely. And it's really striking how often, especially in these, critical discussions about agriculture or nature conservation or global climate policy, one particular term keeps popping up.
Which one?
Stewardship.
Ah, stewardship. Okay, yeah. It's definitely one of those words you hear a lot. But, I mean, often without much clarity, or if we're honest, without folks fully getting the historical weight behind it.
Right. It can feel a bit fuzzy, can it? Sort of undefined. And sometimes just using the word itself sparks controversy. Like some people might think it sounds purely human-centric, maybe, while others connect it really deeply to this profound care for the earth and, everything living on it.
And that ambiguity, that's precisely why we're diving into it today.
Really?
Our mission really for this deep dive is to unpack this powerful but, yeah, often misunderstood concept.
Okay, so cutting through the confusion.
Exactly. We want to reveal its surprising depth, its practical applications. We'll explore its pretty rich history, clarify its meaning, which is multifaceted, and really talk about why it's so profoundly relevant for us right here, right now.
So basically giving you, the listener, a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on this really vital idea.
That's the plan.
All right. And to guide us on this journey, we've got some fantastic sources lined up. We'll be drawing heavily from a really insightful inaugural lecture. It's called Stewardship Revisited, a Conceptual Analysis by Professor Jan van der Stoep.
And alongside that, we're using a really comprehensive academic work known simply as the stewardship paradigm.
Just the stewardship paradigm. Okay. Yeah. And together, these texts give us this extensive look at stewardship across philosophy, history, economics, law. It's a real treasure trove of insight.
Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us. Let's get started.
Defining stewardship, more than just management. Okay, so let's unpack this. Whenever we're dealing with a concept that feels a bit, nebulous, it's always good to start at the very beginning. The roots.
Right. The etymology.
Exactly. And that means looking at the word steward itself, which it turns out has been around for a very long time. We're talking 11th century English origins here.
That's right. The English word steward, it was originally formed by combining two older words. You had stig, which meant house or dwelling.
Stig.
And weird, which is an ancient word for a warden or a guardian.
Ah, stigweir, house warden, makes sense.
So literally a steward was, a person who managed an estate on behalf of a landlord. And it's kind of fascinating that this profession, in its literal sense, it actually still exists today, estate managers, certain household staff. So it started out very practically as a job title, basically. But like we hinted at earlier, stewardship has definitely moved way beyond that literal professional definition.
Oh, absolutely.
It's often used now in a much broader, almost metaphorical sense, isn't it, to describe something bigger, like the place of humans in the cosmos, maybe, or the specific, calling that we as humans have.
Precisely. Our role in the grand scheme of things. And to really get a handle on this broader, more profound understanding, our sources offer up this really helpful, comprehensive 4-part definition. It basically serves as our guiding framework for this whole deep dive.
Okay, let's hear it. The 4 pillars.
Right. So according to this definition, stewardship is, first, the sustainable management of goods.
Sustainable management, got it.
Second, it's always embedded in relationships of care.
Relationships of care. Crucial.
Third, it takes into account that humans are dependent on the soil and on other living beings. We're not separate.
Okay, interdependence.
And finally, fourth, that humans are also responsible for their actions.
Responsible for actions. Okay, so sustainable management, relationships of care, interdependence, and responsibility.
Exactly. It pulls it all together.
So it's definitely not just about, managing resources efficiently. It's managing them sustainably with care, recognizing we're part of this bigger web of life, and owning up to what we do. That really does provide a clear lens, doesn't it, for looking at how this concept developed and why it feels so relevant today. It's much, much more than just a job title. It's like a fundamental way of being in the world.
A posture towards the world, yeah.
Yeah.
2, The historical journey of stewardship,
Yeah.
from ancient households to global responsibilities. And what's really fascinating when you look historically is how this concept of stewardship initially came about with these really strong economic connotations. It was deeply tied to, well, household activities.
Right. The oikos.
Exactly. The
Right.
very term economics is derived from oikos, that Greek word for house, family, or estate. So, careful management of a household's resources, that was the original domain.
That connection between house and economics is, well, it's a powerful reminder, isn't it, of how fundamental careful administration used to be considered.
It really is. And the sources point out that particularly in the history of the church, the term stewardship often popped up in relation to accounting activities.
Managing the books.
Pretty much the management of money and goods, essentially the properties of a church community. It was all about sound financial and material governance within that specific household of faith.
But obviously, it hasn't stayed confined just to the church's accounts or, family budgets. We hear it applied to the environment all the time now.
Not at all. Especially in, say, the last few decades, the term has really broadened its meaning significantly. Stewardship, as we tend to use it today, doesn't just refer to economics anymore.
Right.
It's expanded to include ecology in a big way. It's about our common home, the world we live in together with all other living beings. It implies this deep commitment to nature conservation and the responsible management of entire ecosystems.
So it's really scaled up, hasn't it? From the family estate or the church community to the global commons, the whole planet.
That's a great way to put it. It demands our attention for the whole planet now.
And this expansion, this idea of including the natural world, it isn't actually a brand new idea, is it? Even if it feels more prominent recently. Our sources show that thinkers way back during the Reformation, people like John Wycliffe, Martin Luther, and especially John Calvin, they were already explicitly connecting stewardship to how we use land and natural resources centuries ago.
Indeed. And there's a leading text, a really influential one in this context. It's Calvin's commentary on Genesis 2.15. It speaks directly to this.
Okay, what did he say?
Well, he wrote, and I'll quote a bit here, "Let him who possesses a field so partake of its yearly fruits, that he may not suffer the ground to be injured by his negligence.
Don't be negligent, okay?
But let him endeavor to hand it down to posterity as he received it, or even better cultivated."
Or even better cultivated.
Yeah. "Let him so feed on its fruits that he neither dissipates it by luxury, nor permits it to be marred or ruined by neglect. Let everyone regard himself as the steward of God in all things which he possesses."
That is a genuinely powerful statement. And, a couple of things jump out immediately for me. First, Calvin seems really clear that just because you legally own something, that doesn't give you an unrestricted claim, morally speaking.
What exactly?
It's like people have the land on loan, as he puts it. You can't take your possessions with you into the grave, right? Sooner or later, you have to hand them over. It's more like a temporary custodianship, a responsibility, not some absolute right.
And the second big thing, as you were saying, is how remarkably similar it sounds to how we talk about sustainable development today.
Right. It's uncanny.
The core message is crystal clear. We have this obligation, this duty to pass on this world to future generations in the same condition we received it, or ideally, even better. People can enjoy the fruits, the benefits, but they are expressly forbidden from exhausting the soil, neglecting the land, or polluting it.
So it's not just about preservation, like keeping things static.
Yeah.
It's about active improvement, active care for those who come after us.
That's the core of it.
And this responsibility, does it stop at land and future humans? Or does stewardship also imply care for, say, animals and the broader society?
Oh, absolutely. While Calvin's quote there focuses mainly on future generations, the sources we looked at really emphasize that stewardship legitimately extends to include animals and society at large.
Okay.
Scholars like Worrell and Appleby, for instance, they explicitly call for a balanced account of the interests of society, future generations, and other species, as well as of private needs.
So balancing all these interests.
Yeah. And even Calvin himself stressed that animals are, quote, entitled to life and happiness, and we should handle them gently. This isn't some, minor add-on. It's seen as an integral part of the stewardship concept, demanding a much broader scope of care than just human concerns.
So stewardship isn't just some nice vague idea then, or a non-committal affair, as the sources put it. It sounds like it demands real, practical changes in how we live and organize things.
It absolutely does. If you understand it in this comprehensive way, it has serious, practical, real-world implications. It points towards things like circular agriculture, where input and output are in balance and where farming practices are nature inclusive.
Right, working with nature, not just extracting from it.
Exactly. And it also implies needing an economy where fair prices are being paid, ensuring justice within the larger societal household. It really means moving beyond a purely extractive or exploitative mindset to one based on sustainable interaction and, well, reciprocity.
And this feels fundamentally different from a purely human-centric worldview where, the assumption is often that everything exists solely for human benefit.
It is fundamentally different. A stewardship approach places humans as an integral part of creation. We live within it, not above it. This ties into that Old Testament cosmology, which is described as theocentric, meaning it's not humanity at the center or even nature itself at the center. It's God.
Theocentric, right.
And in this view, all living beings praise God in their own way. They don't necessarily need humans for that purpose. This idea is crucial because it flips our usual perspective. Nature isn't just a resource pile for us to exploit. It has its own inherent value, its own purpose, independent of human needs.
That really reshapes our role then, doesn't it? It puts limits on what we think we can justifiably do.
Definitely. And the Old Testament also made this interesting distinction between wild and domesticated nature. The task to cultivate and care for the earth related primarily to domesticated nature fields, orchards, farm animals, which humans had a duty to treat well. But the relationship with wild animals, wild nature, was different. It favored more of a policy of non-interference.
Non-interference with the wild. That feels very relevant today, where it seems like we interfere absolutely everywhere. How does that ancient distinction connect to our modern world?
With profound urgency, actually. The sources highlight that just as perhaps in ancient times, we are now experiencing the threat of non-human nature reacting, almost rebelling against us because of our overexploitation.
We're seeing the consequences.
We are, and therefore it's really crucial to emphasize that stewardship, properly understood, places limits on human civilization. It absolutely cannot exist without reducing human impact and practicing genuine self-restraint. We can no longer just shift the burden of our lifestyle onto the environment or onto people elsewhere in the world or onto future generations.
Oh, man. That's a heavy thought.
It is. We have to factor these costs, these externalities, into our current ways of doing things right now.
That sounds like a huge challenge, maybe even a bit overwhelming, but also a call to action. Where does hope fit into this perspective? Because sometimes it feels like all we talk about is climate catastrophe and, impending doom.
Hope is absolutely central here. The concept of stewardship, precisely because it connects with responsibility, becomes incredibly relevant for navigating today's challenges. It appeals to people, but importantly, it doesn't demand what's beyond their capacity.
Okay.
Hope, in this context, means something like stopping the desire to control absolutely everything while still holding on to the expectation, the possibility of a better world. A good steward focuses on what they want to leave behind.
Right, the legacy.
That act in itself is an act of hope. It's an act of trust that somehow there will be a future. And while there's no guarantee of a perfect happy ending, that uncertainty doesn't relieve us from the duty, the responsibility to care for the things entrusted to us.
So it's about intentional action for a future we might not fully control, but for which we still bear responsibility. Acting in hope, maybe.
Precisely. Stewardship is our calling to try and leave the world a better place. It urges us to create what the sources call places of hope.
Places of hope. I like that. What does that look like?
Well, places where humans, animals, and plants can flourish together, each in their own way. Think about regenerative forms of agriculture, maybe. Or new cooperatives forming between farmers and citizens, kind of like modern returns to the idea of the commons, but in a more nature-inclusive way.
Okay, tangible examples.
Yeah, or even new food cultures that celebrate the fullness of life, not just mass production. These places of hope can serve as examples, as best practices, where new experiences are gained, stimulating our imagination for how the world could be, how it should be. It allows us to make new beginnings, however small they might seem, upon which future generations can hopefully build.
It's fascinating, too, how these ideas aren't just limited to Abrahamic traditions. This sense of profound responsibility seems to echo way back to the ancient Greeks, doesn't it? With their concept of oikonomia.
Indeed, oikonomia, literally household management. And it's absolutely foundational to stewardship. The earliest definition we actually have of an oikonomos, a steward, comes from Isidore of Pelusium, around 435 BCE.
Okay, what did he say?
He defined an oikonomos as someone who distributes from the household for appropriate needs at the proper time.
Appropriate needs, proper time. Sounds very measured.
It does. And that definition already implies several key aspects we've been talking about. wise stewardship, the duty to balance competing claims, apportioning resources appropriately, and the importance of the steward's own character. The steward, in essence, is seen as a servant to the household's needs.
And Plato, didn't he take this concept even further, like elevated it to a kind of universal art?
That's right. Plato saw the art of stewardship as applicable across numerous domains, not just managing money, but legal arrangements, the management of one's own body or life, the arrangement of materials in the arts, even the arrangement of one's personal conduct.
Wow, so it covered everything.
Pretty much. He even went so far as to suggest that a king is the best oikonomos because a king manages the largest household imaginable in the entire universe.
Okay, that's taking it to the extreme. But it shows the breadth of the concept even back then. It was way beyond just financial management. It was about ethical living.
Exactly, and Aristotle reinforced this. For him, stewardship was about the ethical management of resources to provide a comfortable existence, but not just for oneself. Always having regard for and concern about others. He considered it one of the most honored of the faculties.
One of the most honored faculties. That says a lot.
It does. It underscores the moral dimension. And then you have the pseudo-Aristotelian text Economica, which explicitly introduces this idea of a providential arranging behind oikonomia.
Providential arranging, like a guiding force.
Sort of, yeah. The idea of a higher purpose in this management emerges quite early. And later, Philodemus, who was an Epicurean writer, he deepened this understanding even further. He added the crucial idea that a steward ensures resources are put to their highest and best use.
Highest and best use, that sounds important. What does it mean?
It means they are developed or utilized well. It implies this qualitative dimension to management focused on maximizing flourishing or well-being, not just, say, profit or output.
This ancient wisdom, you can really see how it flows into the New Testament and the teachings of the early church, can't you? Especially that idea of broadening the household beyond just the immediate family.
It absolutely does. The New Testament uses parables quite effectively to highlight wise stewardship, emphasizing that need to balance claims, apportion resources appropriately, and the paramount importance of character. The steward is often portrayed as a servant.
Right.
And Paul's letters, for instance, they state a very clear duty to provide for his own, especially of his own household. He even says failure to do so is worse than an unbeliever.
Strong words.
Very. But then in Galatians, this household concept expands to include the household of faith, which suggests a kind of prioritized but definitely expanding circle of moral obligation, one that ultimately connects to that general duty to love one's neighbor.
So it starts with immediate family, your dependents, then extends outward to the faith community, and then presumably even further.
That seems to be the trajectory.
And what about wealth itself in the New Testament? Was it seen as inherently good or bad? It's often a tricky subject.
It is. The New Testament isn't necessarily against wealth per se. It sometimes links it to the idea of fruitfulness. However, it strongly cautions against hoarding and excessive personal use.
Okay.
The early converts in Jerusalem, as described in the book of Acts, they took this teaching quite literally. It says they treated their property as common property so that there was not a needy person among them.
Wow. Common property.
Yeah, but it's emphasized this was a voluntary sharing. It was driven by what the sources call a communism of love, not some forced obligation. John the Baptist's teaching, he who has 2 coats is to share with him who has none, further exemplifies this quite radical commitment to sharing what you have.
This blend, then, of Greek philosophical ideas about management and these Judeo-Christian teachings about care and sharing, it really seems to come together during the patristic period, the time of the early church fathers.
Yes. That era marks the first really substantive fusion of these 2 streams of thought. And the core principle that emerged was fascinating. It wasn't the having of riches that mattered, not ownership or proprietary rights in themselves. It was what the possessor of the resources did with them that was decisive.
Action over possession.
Exactly. Skillful use was affirmed, but not accumulation for its own sake. Any excess wealth was considered to be for others, especially the poor and, interestingly, strangers.
Strangers, too. Why them specifically?
It was justified by the underlying premise that all things ultimately come from God, which means no single person has an absolute right to do whatever they please with anything. It belongs, in a sense, to everyone, or at least carries obligations towards everyone.
And this wasn't just, abstract theology being debated. They actually put these beliefs into practice, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. There are some striking examples. Take Basil, the 4th century bishop. He lived out these beliefs by establishing this huge welfare center right at the gates of Caesarea. It was for the poor, the old, the sick, and it even included a hospice for penniless travelers.
A major social project.
Huge. And it's often credited as possibly the first Christian hospital specifically built to care for lepers. This dramatically expanded the practical meaning of the household concept. It now clearly included all those who were vulnerable and in need, well beyond traditional family or even community ties. It shows this real-world commitment to stewardship as a broad communal responsibility.
So fast forward a bit to the medieval period. Did these ideas about justice, property, and obligation continue to develop?
They did. Thomas Aquinas, for example, a major figure, he emphasized that resources must never be used as a vehicle for injustice. He also argued that even primary obligations, like caring for your parents, don't justify breaching other moral obligations, like fulfilling contracts you've made.
Okay, so balancing different layers of responsibility.
Right. It showed that stewardship was becoming understood as a much broader ethical concept than just personal piety or family duty. It extended into wider societal responsibilities, into the realm of justice.
Interesting.
And later, you had figures like John Wycliffe, who even supported the government's right to seize property from corrupt clergy. His justification: stewardship. If someone wasn't being a wise steward, he argued, they shouldn't be allowed to control those resources.
Wow, that's a strong claim. Using stewardship to justify state intervention.
It is. And then Thomas More, in his famous book Utopia, written in 1516, he continued this thread, advocating for a kind of voluntary communism based on communal resource management, partly as a critique of the society he saw around him. So these thinkers, despite their differences, they all saw resources as this crucial context for working out moral obligations within a community.
Then we arrive at the Protestant Reformation, with figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin again. Did they offer more practical guidance on stewardship for, the everyday person?
They absolutely did. Martin Luther, in the early 16th century, gave some very practical advice. He defined the relevant household in his context primarily as the city, and he suggested that such a community could, and perhaps should, discriminate between those who were genuinely in need and those who were, well, maybe freeloaders.
Ah, the freeloader problem. Still debated today.
Exactly. His aim was to ensure needs were met while also addressing potential abuses. His solutions were deeply rooted in relationships of care, very consistent with those ancient teachings we talked about.
And Calvin, revisiting him, he also delved into the practical side of wealth and responsibility, didn't he? Setting out some clear parameters.
He did. John Calvin, particularly in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, he really articulated that submission to Christ entails obligations, not absolute rights over possessions. He stated that resources are to be used, primarily having regard to one's gifts and calling, recognizing that there is an obligation as a steward to give an account to God.
Accountable to God for how you use things.
Right. Now, he didn't condemn wealth itself, but he definitely cautioned against its traps. He allowed for the enjoyment of resources beyond just bare necessities. He even noted that good flavors were not added to food value without a purpose, which is a nice touch.
Yeah. God wants us to enjoy good food.
Apparently so. But, crucially, he stressed the need for temperance and self-control, especially when you have abundance at hand, to avoid extravagance. His summary for Christians was pretty clear. Christian liberty, he said, is, however, subject to this law. He must indulge as little as possible. On the other hand, it must be his constant aims not only to curb luxury.
That's quite a balance to strike enjoying creation's gifts with significant restraint. And then John Wesley, centuries later, he offered that very practical fourfold test, didn't he, for assessing moral expenditure?
Yes, John Wesley provided these really clear guiding questions for assessing how you use your resources. The sources say they offer clear light for decision-making. He asked, essentially.
Okay, let's hear Wesley's test.
1. Am I acting herein not as a proprietor but as a steward of my Lord's goods? 2. Am I doing this in obedience to his word? 3. Can I offer up this action, this expense, as a sacrifice to God through Jesus Christ? And 4. Have I reason to believe that for this very work I shall have a reward at the resurrection of the just?
Wow. Those are searching questions.
Yeah.
They really bring the concept of stewardship right down to a deeply personal, ethical level, don't they? Providing very clear moral guidance for everyday choices.
Exactly. A very practical framework. 3. The dominant paradigm. the erosion of obligations and rise of absolute rights.
Okay, so it really sounds like stewardship had this incredibly rich and actually quite consistent history for centuries. Ideas built on each other, refining the concept. But then, as we mentioned, something fundamental seems to have shifted. The Enlightenment period, it seems, introduced some really critical difficulties into these discussions about how we allocate resources, didn't it? Yeah.
It absolutely did. It marks a major turning point. After the Enlightenment, discussions about resources almost invariably started centering on an agenda set by, well, classical liberal individualist philosophers.
Okay.
And the focus shifted dramatically. It moved away from those inherent obligations we've been talking about towards individual rights to private property and the concept of ownership. And often, crucially, this focus on rights tended to exclude, or at least downplay, the moral obligations that people previously thought naturally accompanied those rights.
So rights took center stage and responsibilities got pushed to the side.
That's a good way to summarize the shift. It created this fundamental imbalance, moving from with rights come responsibilities to something much closer to just my rights.
And Thomas Hobbes, writing in the mid-17th century, he played a pretty significant role in laying this new foundation, didn't he?
He certainly did. In his major work, Leviathan, from 1651, Hobbes famously argued that in the hypothetical state of nature, before any social contract, every man has right to everything, and consequently, no action can be unjust.
Right to everything, nothing is unjust. Wow.
Yeah. Justice, for Hobbes, only emerges with the formation of a social contract and a sovereign power to enforce it. This laid a foundation where the entire analysis of justice and property started to be understood purely in the context of legal relations emanating from that sovereign power.
So property becomes something the state grants and defines.
Essentially, yes. Property, in this view, becomes simply a matter of state limitation on usage, primarily designed to exclude others from your claim. The moral dimension fades into the background.
And then John Locke, who came a bit later, he's often seen as an alternative to Hobbes. But did he still largely follow this path of emphasizing individual property rights?
Yeah.
Perhaps pushing towards an even more absolute view?
Locke's work, yeah, it profoundly shaped property discussions for centuries to come, influencing both liberal and Marxist thought, interestingly enough. His core thesis was that the very purpose of civil government is the protection of individual rights, including property rights, which he argued originated before government.
Okay, so government protects pre-existing rights.
Right. But he designed a framework where property was, as the sources put it, arrogated to individuals absolutely without need to refer to others. It solidified this idea of individual ownership being primary. As the modern legal scholar Bruce Welling articulated it, kind of summing up this legacy, legal relationships are what property is all about. Property is a relationship. There are always three people in a relationship. The first person is the state.
The state is the first person in the property relationship. That's stark.
It is. It really highlights how the state becomes the central arbiter of property in this dominant view, rather than, say, inherent moral obligations or communal relationships being the foundation.
This strong emphasis on individual rights and state, granted or at least state-protected property, seems like it feeds directly into so many of our modern debates about equality, doesn't it? Who deserves what share of resources?
It absolutely does. The premise that all human beings are created equal logically leads, for many thinkers, to arguments for prima facie rights to an equal share of property.
Right. If we're all equal, shouldn't we all start with equal stuff?
That's the argument. You see thinkers like P.J. Proudhon in his work, What is Property?, arguing that equality dictates that land must be divided and redivided equally, and ultimately that no one should own anything privately.
Property is theft, basically.
That was his famous conclusion. And this line of thought also underpins the classic Marxist position, from each according to his ability to each according to his need.
Okay.
More recently, you have thinkers like Bruce Ackerman in Social Justice and the Liberal State, concluding that each generation should be entitled to an equal start, which could be achieved through mechanisms like inheritance tax.
Leveling the starting field.
Exactly. And Ronald Dworkin argued that taxation should be used to level better than average talents and bring up the poor, although he drew a line, saying it shouldn't tax away wealth derived from wise investment or completely remove inequalities arising from different choices.
So lots of debate on how equal things should be, but starting from that individual rights perspective.
Largely, yes. But even with these varying approaches, that core idea of absolute individual property rights faces a fundamental challenge. As the legal philosopher J.W. Harris concluded, and it's a powerful quote, "Property institutions cannot be erected on natural rights to full-blooded ownership because there are none.
Whoa, there are none. That's a huge statement.
Yeah.
It basically says this idea of having sole and despotic dominion over your property, as Blackstone famously put it, it's just not borne out in reality, not even in a purely legal sense.
Precisely. The sources really emphasize this point. Private property, as we actually know it and experience it, is always subject to limitations. Always.
Such as?
Well, think about it. There's the law of taxation. There's eminent domain, the government's right to take private property for public use with compensation. There's the law of nuisances, which stops you using your property in a way that harms others. And there are the general obligations of property owners to use due care so they don't injure people.
Right. You can't just do absolutely anything you want in your land.
Exactly. These limitations are based on the rights and well-being of other individuals and the community. They fundamentally undermine that simplistic notion of absolute, unrestricted ownership.
So this dominant philosophical paradigm, the one that's shaped so much of our modern thinking about resources and rights since the Enlightenment, it sounds like it has some pretty serious problems then. What are the biggest difficulties identified in the sources?
It does, and the sources highlight 5 fundamental difficulties that make this dominant paradigm, well, inadequate is the word they use.
Okay, number 1.
First, rights without obligations. That intense focus on the individual's right to private property very often leads to excluding or minimizing the moral obligations that historically were thought to naturally accompany those rights. We spend more time asking who owns this than who is responsible for this and to whom.
Okay, the missing obligation piece. What's second?
Second, abstract theories versus reality. Many of these theories rely on abstract, fictitious concepts like Hobbes' state of nature or John Rawls's original position behind a veil of ignorance. The critique is that these are purely fictitious, they're not provable, and they fail to capture the richness and complexity of actual human communities and lived reality.
Detached from how people actually live and relate. Makes sense. Third,
exclusion of community and relationships. By postulating these abstract scenarios, these philosophies effectively erode the very basis for many moral obligations. They tend to ignore the shared relationships, the mutual dependencies, the networks of care, and the reciprocal obligations that actually exist within real communities. They abstract the individual out of their social context.
Right. We don't exist in a vacuum. What's the fourth difficulty?
Fourth, disregard for legal wisdom. The dominant philosophical discourse, particularly in the 20th century, largely ignored the accumulated wisdom and the practical methodology developed by the judicial system over centuries. Courts, by resolving real conflicts, whether it's a family fighting over a will or businesses disputing a contract, are constantly dealing with interrelated rights and obligations anchored in relationships. The law has always dealt with real people in real relationships, a richness often overlooked by purely abstract theories.
Okay, so ignoring the practical wisdom embedded in law. And the fifth?
Fifth, weak motivation for compliance. If the only motive for moral conduct regarding resources is basically social preservation, just keeping the system from collapsing, then the motivation for individuals to actually comply is inherently weak, isn't it? Especially when there might be significant personal benefit gained by not complying.
The incentive problem.
Exactly. As the economist Fred Hirsch noted, even from within the liberal tradition, there are real limits of selfishness. Purely individualistic motives often fail to sustain collective well-being or long-term flourishing.
Okay, so let me try and summarize those critiques of the dominant philosophies. It sounds like the argument is they've kind of lost their way in their language, focusing too much on rights and not enough on duties. They can't provide a really solid justification for their central premise of absolute individual control over resources. They seem out of step with the basic human experience of living in communities defined by care and interdependence. And maybe surprisingly, they're even out of step with how the law actually works in practice.
That's a very good summary. It's a pretty comprehensive and, quite a damning assessment presented in the sources. 4, the stewardship paradigm, a modern framework for ethical resource allocation.
All right, so given those really significant shortcomings of the dominant paradigm, the sources then present the stewardship paradigm as, well, an alternative, a potentially more useful approach.
Exactly. It's presented as inherently more useful precisely because it seeks to address those deficiencies directly. It aims to provide robust moral guidance for making decisions about resource allocation and utilization, something the dominant paradigm struggles with.
So it's not just about pointing out the problems with the old way, but offering a new, more unified way of thinking, something that might help with some of the huge problems we face today.
That's the core idea. It offers a completely different methodology, a different agenda, really, one that's rooted firmly in shared responsibilities and the reality of relationships within a community.
Back to relationships again.
And what's really interesting is how it transcends those traditional academic silos. It weaves together insights from philosophy, economics, law, history, aiming for a truly holistic view. It brings us back full circle to those 4 pillars we defined right at the start: sustainable management, relationships of care, human dependence, and responsibility for our actions.
Okay, so how does this stewardship framework actually work in practice then? If you're trying to make a decision about resources, what are the core elements you need to consider?
The framework, as laid out for assessing resource decisions and behaviors, rests on 3 critical factors. Think of them as 3 pillars for decision-making.
Okay, pillar 1.
Pillar 1 is the nature of the steward themselves, who is actually managing the resource.
Okay, the person in charge. Pillar 2.
Pillar 2 is the nature of the resource itself. What is being managed? What are its characteristics?
Makes sense. And pillar 3.
Pillar 3 is the characteristics of the claimants. Who benefits from or is affected by or has a potential claim on this resource?
Steward, resource, claimants. Okay, let's break those down a bit more. Starting with the steward, why is their nature so important?
The nature of the steward is crucial because the origin or the source of the resource often dictates certain obligations about how it should be used. These are what the sources call moral strings attached.
Strings attached, like conditions.
Exactly. Inherent expectations or moral conditions on how the resource should be applied, used, or distributed. So the steward has to ask themselves, can I actually perform in accordance with these strings? If a steward's attitude or intentions make them unwilling to comply with these inherent moral conditions, that suggests a morally questionable stance right from the outset.
Okay, give me an example of strings attached.
Well, imagine inheriting a piece of land that has been in the family for generations with a clear, understood legacy of using it for community benefit, maybe hosting community events or allowing access. If the new inheritor, the steward, decides to just hoard it, fence it off completely for purely personal gain, ignoring that legacy, that's a moral failure related to the nature of the steward and the implicit strings attached to that resource.
Got it. It's like receiving a gift with a specific purpose, and you have an obligation to try and fulfill that purpose. Now, what about the second pillar, the nature of the resource itself?
The nature of the resource is equally vital. A wise steward, as we saw discussed by thinkers like Philodemus and Calvin, strives to ensure resources are put to their highest and best use, meaning they are developed or utilized well.
That highest and best use idea again.
It's a recurring theme. Furthermore, some resources, just because of what they are, demand specialized knowledge or specific skills from the steward. Think about handling potent drugs, or maybe confidential medical information. These aren't things just anyone can manage appropriately. They require specific expertise.
Right, you need qualifications.
Exactly. Or consider if a resource is inherently dangerous, like, say, welding equipment being used near flammable substances. That imposes much stricter supervision requirements and a higher degree of responsibility on the steward. And importantly, the dangerous character isn't always inherent in the object itself, but often depends on the context in which it's being used. This awareness of context can lead to what's termed a non-delegable duty of care in law. You can't just pass the buck.
Okay, so the resource itself dictates certain responsibilities. And I remember you mentioned earlier that really interesting analogy about the resource itself sometimes being considered a claimant. How does that fit in?
That's a very compelling idea found in some worldviews that challenges our usual human-centric perspective. The sources use this great example of choosing a Christmas tree. Instead of cutting down a small young tree entirely, a wise steward might consider taking just a branch off a larger mature tree.
Why?
Because the small tree then gets to continue growing to maturity as it perhaps should, fulfilling its potential, and the larger tree, it will likely just grow another branch. This illustrates considering the resource's own flourishing, its own integrity, not just how it can be utilized immediately for human benefit. It means asking, maybe, what does this resource need to thrive alongside what can I get from it?
That is a subtle but really profound shift in perspective. Okay, finally, let's talk about the third pillar, the characteristics of the claimants. This is where it gets down to distribution, right? Who gets what?
Exactly. This third pillar, the characteristics of the claimants, is where the rubber meets the road in terms of deciding how resources are allocated. First, the framework suggests you might have an initial exclusion.
Exclusion. How so?
Well, some potential claimants or proposed uses might be excluded right away if those moral strings attached to the resource simply cannot be ethically met by that claimant or use. Or if the nature of the resource itself makes certain claims inappropriate, for example, if it requires specialized skills that a potential claimant clearly lacks. So it's not just a free-for-all where every claim is equally valid initially.
Okay, some claims might be ruled out from the start based on the steward or resource pillars. What comes next?
Then the framework asks us to identify claimants who are in extreme need, and conversely, to identify situations where resources owned by someone else are perhaps in excess, which is being wasted or hoarded.
Need versus waste.
Right. Stewardship suggests that intervention, for example, through governmental action like taxation, becomes progressively more morally justifiable, as an individual's comfort levels increase to the point of luxury and outright waste. Wastefulness here isn't just letting food rot. It includes excessive personal use far beyond reasonable comfort. Conversely, things like tax benefits might be appropriate where resources are being actively developed and utilized for their best possible purposes, benefiting the community.
So the more you have beyond a comfortable living, especially if you're being wasteful with it, the stronger the moral justification becomes for society to potentially intervene to help those in genuine need.
That's the principle. But then, the two most significant and ultimately decisive features that need to be weighed are proximity and vulnerability.
Proximity and vulnerability. Tell me more.
These two factors are best considered together in relation to each other. Proximity captures the strength of a claimant's relationship with the steward, and consequently the strength of their claim upon the steward. This can range from, say, a dependent spouse or child, very high proximity, to immediate family, then maybe the local community, and then wider humanity, more remote proximity.
Okay, closeness of relationship matters. And vulnerability.
Vulnerability measures the degree to which a claimant depends on the steward for their well-being. A young child, for instance, is extremely vulnerable and highly proximate to their parents, creating a very strong claim. Someone living in poverty on the other side of the world might be highly vulnerable, but much less proximate, creating a different kind of claim.
So it's about who is closest to you relationally and who relies on you the most for their basic needs. Those create the strongest claims.
Generally, yes. Those relationships and dependencies create stronger claims within the stewardship framework. Now, while the idea of equality might seem like the obvious solution to some stewards after weighing all these factors, stewardship prioritizes based on these concrete relationships and contextual needs, not necessarily on achieving absolute equality of outcome for everyone. It aims for a just allocation based on need, responsibility, and connection.
This sounds like a pretty logical, almost step-by-step decision-making framework. If we were to visualize it, maybe like a flowchart or a matrix, how would that decision process flow?
You could definitely visualize it that way. Imagine a series of questions you'd ask. First, are there moral strings attached to this resource based on its source or history? If yes, can the steward realistically and ethically comply with them? If not, that's a major red flag right there.
Okay, check the strings next.
Next, does the nature of the resource itself lend itself better to certain claimants or uses? Does it require specific skills? Does it impose stricter responsibilities because it's dangerous?
Consider the resource's demands.
Then you assess the claimants. Are any claimants in extreme need? Conversely, are there instances of significant hoarding or waste among potential beneficiaries or even the steward themselves?
Address need and waste. And finally,
only after considering those factors do you really weigh proximity and vulnerability together. These are usually the most significant factors in determining the priorities, who should get what, when, and how much. It's a comprehensive, systematic way to think through resource decisions, moving beyond simple ownership rights.
so this framework, it's clearly not just about individual ethics or personal choices. It sounds like it has much broader implications for how we organize society, how we think about policy.
Absolutely. The sources really stress that stewardship as a concept is applicable to all of life. Public and private spheres, personal conduct, group behavior, and social attitudes. It profoundly suggests that morality, especially when it concerns resources, is essentially communal, not individual. It's fundamentally about how we manage our shared world within our dense web of interconnected relationships and responsibilities. The stewardship in action, modern relevance, and legal echoes.
Okay, so what does this all mean for us today then, in a really practical sense? How can this stewardship paradigm actually inform things like political philosophy or maybe even our legal systems. This feels like where the rubber truly meets the road.
This is indeed where the paradigm really shows its potential relevance. From a political philosophy standpoint, for example, stewardship can refine theories like John Rawls's influential theory of justice.
How so? Rawls focused on justice as fairness, right?
Right. And particularly his difference principle, which states that inequalities are only justified if they benefit the least advantaged members of society. Stewardship can integrate this principle by clearly recognizing the different groups to whom duties are owed within a community, and explicitly giving priority within the overall scheme of justice to those most vulnerable, aligning perfectly with Rawls' core concern for the least advantaged.
So it adds a layer of relational context to Rawls' abstract principle.
You could say that. And even institutions like, say, the United States Supreme Court, when acting as what Rawls called an exemplar of public reason, arguably embody principles compatible with stewardship when they grapple with complex resource distribution disputes, trying to find a just and fair outcome that considers various claims and duties, often rooted implicitly in relational obligations.
That's an interesting thought. And thinking about real-world policy, taxation seems like a prime area for applying these ideas about resource allocation and redistribution. How would stewardship principles apply to tax policy?
Taxation policy is an excellent case study, yeah. Stewardship offers quite clear moral guidance here. Remember that principle. Governmental interference through mechanisms like taxation becomes progressively more morally justifiable as private comfort levels move towards luxury and outright waste.
Right, the more excess and waste, the stronger the moral case for taxing it.
Exactly. And conversely, tax benefits or incentives might be appropriate where resources are being actively developed and utilized for their best possible purposes, maybe creating community benefits or environmental improvements. Consider a real-world debate, like the one mentioned in the sources about Australia introducing a goods and services tax, GST, a flat 10% tax on most goods and services.
Okay, a flat consumption tax.
Right. The argument was often made that it would increase overall national wealth. But stewardship would compel us to ask deeper questions. Does such a policy truly align with principles of care and responsibility? Who bears the burden disproportionately? Does it exacerbate hardship for the vulnerable, even if it increases net wealth overall? Or does it primarily favor individual gain? It shifts the focus from purely economic efficiency metrics to the ethical impact on relationships and well-being within the community.
That's a really powerful lens to apply to tax debates. What about something like humanitarian aid? Our global responsibility to the poor. Many philosophers, like Peter Singer, argue strongly that we have a duty to assist, often focusing on effectiveness. How does stewardship add to or differ from that perspective?
That's another great area of application. Stewardship connects directly to Peter Singer's well-known views on the obligation to assist the poor, particularly his emphasis on maximizing effectiveness in reducing absolute poverty. Stewardship is certainly compatible with seeking efficiency in aid delivery.
But there's a difference.
Yes, a key difference highlighted in the sources is the criterion for decision-making. Stewardship might critically question some of Singer's suggested criteria, such as prioritizing aid based on the attitude of the recipient government. For stewardship, the criterion informing a steward's decision will focus much more heavily on relationship and responsibility, not solely on governmental attitudes or purely long-run versus short-run effectiveness calculations.
So it's more about the immediate need and the connection, maybe, than just the most efficient outcome on paper.
It leans that way. Stewardship isn't overly concerned with national boundaries when it comes to addressing basic human needs. It can, however, imply a greater duty, or at least a more immediate one, to, say, a child you personally sponsor, or perhaps a former fellow student you know who has fallen on hard times, than to others generally, simply because a direct relationship exists. Proximity matters.
So relationship strengthens the obligation.
Yes, and interestingly, Singer himself observes the inadequacy of the dominant individualistic philosophies in dealing effectively with issues that transcend national boundaries, like the global refugee crisis. Stewardship, with its inherent focus on a broader scope of care based on shared humanity and vulnerability, arguably provides a more robust framework for addressing the complex moral questions surrounding insiders and outsiders alike.
It sounds like stewardship is actually quite flexible, capable of integrating with other ethical frameworks too, maybe like utilitarianism.
It is surprisingly compatible in some ways. While utilitarianism, broadly speaking, seeks the greatest good for the greatest number, stewardship adds crucial contextual details for assessing and prioritizing claims on resources. It brings in those factors of vulnerability, proximity, and waste to help determine how to achieve that greater good in a specific situation.
Can you give an example of how that works?
Sure. The sources use a very clear practical example involving Peter Singer again, hypothetically. Imagine Singer has just one apple. His own child is very hungry. According to stewardship principles, the apple goes to the child highest need, highest proximity.
Makes sense.
Now, imagine Singer has a whole sack of apples intended for distribution within a commune he belongs to. Stewardship would suggest he distributes to the members of the commune first. Maybe he gives some leftover apples to pigs later, but the commune members, being more proximate and part of his household, come first. He might even ethically withhold apples from known freeloaders within the commune, considering their health, ability to contribute, and genuine need.
Okay, so it provides a way to make nuanced judgments within a utilitarian goal.
Exactly. It adds concrete application and relational grounding to potentially abstract principles. It helps answer the who first question.
That makes perfect sense. And thinking about other perspectives, it also seems like stewardship would fit really well with feminist ethics or the feminine agenda, which often emphasize care, relationship, and context over abstract rules or rights.
Absolutely. The sources explicitly state that stewardship fits comfortably within many of the themes of the feminist and feminine agenda, precisely because of its strong emphasis on care over abstract principles and individual autonomy.
How so?
Well, it offers a clearly articulatable basis for moral claims to the redistribution of resources, specifically for those who might lack traditional proprietary rights, often women or marginalized groups. It provides a tool for challenging individualistic moral theories, like Lawrence Kohlberg's famous stages of moral maturity, which were initially developed primarily by studying boys and men.
Right, Carol Gilligan critiqued Kohlberg for overlooking an ethic of care.
Exactly. Stewardship aligns with Gilligan's critique by asserting that morality, at least with respect to resource-related issues, is essentially about the evaluation of relationship obligations. It is essentially communal, not individual.
That really reframes how we might look at classic moral dilemmas then, doesn't it? Like the famous Heinz dilemma, the story of the husband who has to decide whether to steal an overpriced drug to save his dying wife.
Precisely. Instead of viewing the Heinz dilemma primarily as a clash between abstract principles like the wrongness of theft versus the right to life, stewardship reframes it. It becomes a consideration of relational duties. The moral maturity isn't necessarily found in adhering strictly to an abstract rule, but perhaps in the caring response, in recognizing and acting upon the profound relational obligations at play between Heinz and his wife. It shows how a seemingly complex individual moral choice is actually deeply rooted in communal responsibilities and the fundamental duty of care within relationships.
So, shifting gears slightly, but staying practical. What does all this mean for our actual legal systems? Do we see echoes, maybe even strong reflections, of these stewardship principles in the law today, even if the word stewardship itself isn't used explicitly all the time?
We absolutely do. The sources argue convincingly that Australian law, which draws heavily from its British common law heritage, a heritage shared by many legal systems, including the US and Canada, implicitly reflects these stewardship principles across various areas. It demonstrates how the law, often seen as just a set of rules, has actually taken up these deeper matters of responsibility and relationship. It shows that the legal system, at its roots, often reflects underlying community values about care and obligation.
Okay, that's fascinating. Where should we start? Maybe with a succession law. That deals with what happens to property after someone dies, which seems very relevant to passing things on.
Succession law is a perfect place to start. It offers several really clear examples. First, think about the rule against perpetuities.
Rule against sounds complicated.
Haha. It can be, but the basic idea is simple. It prevents a deceased person from controlling their resources from the grave indefinitely. Typically, it limits how long control can be dictated by a will, often to around 80 years or maybe a life in being plus 21 years. The point is, it inherently prevents indefinite hoarding by the dead, ensuring resources eventually get redistributed back into the hands of the living.
So you can't tie up property forever based on your wishes from centuries ago. Makes sense.
Right, and interestingly, charitable gifts are often a key exception to this rule against perpetuities. Why? The argument suggested by stewardship principles is that charitable gifts aren't really hoarding. They are seen as giving back to the community, serving a broader good, and thus are treated differently.
That reinforces the idea that resources should serve a purpose beyond just the individual owner, even after death. What about family members who might feel they were unfairly left out of a will or not adequately provided for? Does the law acknowledge any duties there?
It certainly does. That brings us to what are often called family provision laws, or testator's family maintenance laws. Courts in many jurisdictions have the power and often use it to override the terms of a will to ensure adequate provision is made for certain dependents, like spouses or children.
So the deceased person's wishes aren't absolute.
Not entirely. These laws demonstrate that familial claims and the underlying relationships create duties that can actually supersede absolute testamentary freedom. What's considered adequate provision often depends on the size of the estate and the claimant's needs, reflecting a nuanced approach based on relational duties and vulnerability.
Okay.
Furthermore, if a person dies without a will dying intestate, the law doesn't just let the property sit there. A complex set of rules dictates how the property is distributed. And these intestacy rules, the sources argue, are a very strong indication of the priorities society places on moral claims. They almost always follow an order of remoteness based on familial ties, spouse first, then children, then parents, then siblings, and so on.
A hierarchy based on relationship.
Exactly. And this isn't new. It's an ancient concept found in diverse legal traditions. Athenian, Jewish, Roman, Hindu law all had similar principles. It shows a near universal recognition of these primary relational claims based on proximity and dependence.
So this concept of the household, the circle of responsibility, it truly extends in law beyond just the living individuals, shaping how assets are managed and distributed across generations.
Precisely. This idea of the household, with its inherent obligations, is present right at the fountainhead of succession laws. It extends to encompass all those considered within the ambit of the steward's responsibility, particularly those who are most vulnerable and dependent.
Okay, what about criminal law? Does stewardship or the failure of it show up there? It seems like a big leap from wills to crime.
It might seem like a leap, but the connection is there. In criminal law, particularly regarding negligence or endangerment, situations arise where individuals effectively become stewards of resources for another, upon which those others are entirely dependent. Think of a parent caring for a helpless infant, or someone managing dangerous machinery. In such cases, a failure to exercise that stewardship duty, a failure to provide care, can become criminal offense. This includes things like failure to provide necessities of life or criminal negligence in mishandling dangerous things. The core legal principle here is often that vulnerability and dependence upon the steward create a heightened legal obligation, the breach of which can attract criminal sanctions.
So extreme failure of a stewardship duty can cross the line into criminal behavior. What about the law of torts, like negligence? We often hear about a duty of care. Where does that come from?
The duty of care in negligence law is often explicitly traced back, conceptually, to the moral obligation to love one's neighbor, famously articulated in the landmark case of Donahue v. Stevenson. It means you have a legal responsibility to take reasonable care to avoid acts or omissions which you can reasonably foresee would be likely to injure your neighbor, meaning persons closely and directly affected by your actions. And the sources highlight cases like Bernie Port Authority v. General Jones Politi, Ltd. This case illustrates how controlling premises where a dangerous substance is introduced or a dangerous activity is carried on, in that case, welding work near highly flammable materials stored by a tenant creates a special duty. The court held that the party in control, the Port Authority, owed a non-delegable duty of care to avoid foreseeable risk of injury or damage from that dangerous situation.
Non-delegable, meaning they couldn't just blame the contractor doing the welding.
Exactly. Because they controlled the premises and allowed the dangerous situation, they retained ultimate responsibility. The duty is especially strong when others are marked by special dependence or vulnerability. This shows how the law recognizes that control over a resource or situation creates significant obligations, particularly when others are vulnerable or depend on your careful management. The more dangerous the resource or activity, the stricter the supervision required, a clear stewardship principle.
That makes sense. Now, what about contract law? We often think of contracts as being based on freedom of contract, two parties agreeing to whatever terms they want. Is there a limit to that freedom based on stewardship ideas?
Yes, definitely. While freedom of contract is a foundational principle, the sources point out that over the last century or so, both courts and legislatures have become increasingly interventionist. They often step in to protect contracting parties deemed to be vulnerable or in a significantly weaker bargaining position.
Like consumer protection laws.
Exactly. or laws dealing with unconscionable contracts. They limit absolute freedom of contract to ensure fairness and prevent substantive abuse, where one party might exploit the vulnerability or need of another. This reflects a legal recognition that even in commercial dealings, ethical responsibilities and the need to protect the vulnerable can override absolute contractual freedom, echoing that stewardship concern for care and relationship.
Okay, one more area. Equity law. Things like trusts and fiduciary duties. These sound like they're almost directly about stewardship, about managing something for someone else's benefit.
They are indeed very closely related. Equity law developed historically precisely to remedy injustices that sometimes resulted from the strict, rigid application of the common law rules. It's about fairness and conscience.
Right.
In the law of trusts, for instance, a trustee holds property not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of the beneficiaries. They have a strict legal duty, a fiduciary duty to manage that trust property prudently, taking all the precautions an ordinary prudent man would take with their own affairs. And crucially, they must consider not just the present beneficiaries, but often future beneficiaries as well. This clearly shows a legal recognition of a steward's responsibility for a resource over time, balancing different claims.
A legal duty to be a prudent steward.
Pretty much. And the concept of fiduciary relationships extends beyond trusts. It applies whenever one person is in a position that gives them a special opportunity to exercise the power or discretion to the detriment of that other person who is accordingly vulnerable to abuse. Classic examples include company directors owing duties to the company or lawyers to their clients. And interestingly, the sources note that this principle is even being extended in modern legal thought. The duty of company directors, for example, is increasingly seen as extending beyond the company shareholders to consider the interests of other stakeholders, perhaps even the broader community from which the company derives its rights and operates.
Wow, that's a significant potential shift.
It is. It reinforces the core idea running through all these legal examples. Stewardship, understood as a principle of interrelated rights and obligations anchored firmly in relationships, is deeply woven into the very fabric of our legal system, even if we don't always use the label. The simplistic concept of absolute ownership is never truly absolute in practice. It's always shaped and limited by these underlying duties of care and responsibility to others.
Wow, what an incredible journey that was.
Yeah.
We've really unpacked stewardship, haven't we? From its ancient etymological roots, remember, stig and weird, house and warden, through its profound historical development in Greek philosophy, Judeo-Christian thought, the Reformation, and right up to its pervasive, though often maybe unstated, impact on our modern legal systems today. It's truly so much more than just simple management. It's about that sustainable management of goods, always embedded in relationships of care, always recognizing our deep dependence on others and the planet itself, and crucially, taking responsibility for our actions. Those four pillars really hold it together.
Indeed. And what really stands out, I think, is that this isn't some, newfangled concept invented recently to deal with environmental crises, though it's highly relevant there. The sources demonstrate convincingly that stewardship as a pattern or principle expressing our shared moral values about resources covering not just rights, but also obligations, it's present right at the fountainhead of our systematic Greek heritage with Plato and Aristotle. Remember, they called it one of the most honored of faculties.
Right. And you see it so clearly in the relationship-based ethics of Jesus, maybe best exemplified by the parable of the Good Samaritan. And it resonates strongly with modern feminist thought, like the work of Carol Gilligan, emphasizing an ethic of care.
Absolutely. And the fact that it underlies or is at least highly compatible with so many core principles in modern law across succession, criminal law, torts, contracts, equity trusts, fiduciary duties, that just shows how truly foundational it is to our legal structures and arguably our shared societal values, even if we've sometimes lost sight of it.
Yeah, it feels like, as the sources suggested, it was perhaps lost in the pursuit of absolute proprietary rights and ownership agendas, particularly after the Enlightenment. But the argument is that it remains, and perhaps always has been, a crucial framework for understanding our responsibilities to each other and the world, especially now, in an era grappling with resource scarcity, climate change, and deeply interconnected global challenges.
Well said. It offers a way back, perhaps, to a more balanced understanding.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive today, maybe here's a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to mull over. If we truly deeply understood ourselves, not as absolute owners with unrestricted rights, but as temporary stewards, each of us entrusted with resources of varying kinds and degrees, from personal talents to shared ecosystems, what radical shifts might we see? How might things change in how we approach global challenges like climate change or economic inequality, or maybe even how we conduct our most personal relationships?
Mm.
What if every decision we made about resources, from the small things like your daily consumption choices right up to a nation's environmental policy, actually began with the question, how can I best steward this thing, this place, this relationship for all who depend on it, now and in the future, leaving it in the best possible condition for generations yet to come? Something to think about.